this is our organization, Disruptive Technologists in New York City. Already David and Bruce have both been here before as our panelists. Chaz is a new one. And it's an interesting mix. If anyone is here from the city, I know Justin's here, but if anyone's here from the city, thanks, from the city and wants to talk, it's up to Bruce, but usually we're a question and answer. You can like raise your hand in the middle, but it's going to be up to Bruce today because we have a lot to cover.
Okay, thank you, Lauren. So I'm Bruce Backenheimer. My full-time job is as a clinical professor of management at Pace University and the director of our entrepreneurship program, including being the executive director of the entrepreneurship lab. And other activities, I'm involved on the board of Disruptive Technologists and the MIT Enterprise Forum of New York City. And my career has been not a traditional academic. I started out on Wall Street. I started a couple companies in the US and overseas, and a number of other things. But what I thought I would do is just kind of set the stage for what do we mean by social infrastructure, a tech ecosystem, and an inflection point. And then the panelists will introduce themselves. We'll have some prepared questions and then plenty of time from the audience. So again, if you want to use social media, I guess it's best to turn your ringers on your phones off because they are recording it. But if you do want to use social media, it's @DisruptiveTechs. And here's myself, Chaz and David. And as was said, unfortunately, Jessica got to cancel at the last moment because of the Ebola crisis. So what's an inflection point? An inflection point in New York City? There's been lots of them. I didn't want to go too far back in history, but I think you all could probably recognize this. The October 29th, 1929 Black Tuesday, which led to the Great Depression from 29 to 39, eventually created the Securities Act of 1933 and the Exchange Act of 34, which created the SEC, and impacted investing, up until our recent Jobs Act. That's remained pretty much unchanged. So clearly that was an inflection point for business in New York City. And think of inflection points, there's plenty others I could go back, but this is one that I remember quite clearly as someone who was in New York City. Ford, the city dropped dead. You may remember that October 30th, 1975. He actually never said those words, but it makes for good press, so we've kept it all this time later. But if you remember what New York City was like in the mid-70s, it was horrible, dreadfully bad. And we'll talk about that a little bit and how the perceptions have changed from New York City in just a relatively short time, a little over a quarter century. But here's another inflection point for business in New York City. This is clearly the NASDAQ Composite, and you could see on March 10th of 2000 we reached an intraday peak of 5,048 points. Subsequently fell about 80% and climbing back. But that was a big inflection point in New York City, especially with Silicon Alley, that had started in the mid to late 90s and basically disappeared right after this. So it was clearly a lot of sizzle and not that much steak, which is different than where we are now, which we're going to discuss. And to me, this was, I think, a really big inflection point in New York City. I've spoken about this in a few places, but I think this is what really launched the success, or really contributed to the success of, whether you want to call it Silicon Alley 2.0 or not. This was a story in the New York Times, a reversal of fortunes. City takes a new look at Wall Street. And it was city officials plan a shift for Wall Street by promoting startups. Basically a third of our New York City's employment, income, tax base came from Wall Street, and it's been through cycles before. But what was recognized after the 2008 financial crisis, culminating, I guess, on September 15th in 2008 with Lehman Brothers filing Chapter 11, is that, I just used this quote from the article, the next chapter in the history of Wall Street is being written right now. Never has there been a need for such a cultural and intellectual shift in thinking on Wall Street. And again, that social infrastructure inflection point is what we're going to be focusing on. But because Wall Street, there's more engineers in the canyons of Wall Street, some say, than Silicon Valley, but as a bit of an exaggeration. But the big firms were scooping up engineers and talent, and the startups, it was very hard for them to compete. The big firms stopped hiring, even started laying off, and then when the shift in perception that all of a sudden working for, in a suit for Goldman Sachs on Wall Street might not be the most appealing or attractive position, now suddenly being an internet entrepreneur, in Silicon Alley is seen as very desirable. That shift really, I believe, was a big part that helped us where we are now. So when you think about these things, what do cities like New York need to create high growth ventures? This was a list. There's some work done out of MIT by this guy David Burchin, looked at things like, just very quickly, trained workforce, formal and informal diverse networks, like clearly here we're at a network. Universities, Columbia, NYU, NYIT, PACE, etc. Experts, academic, public and private, educated investors and entrepreneurs and angel networks. You can't get a better example than David Rose on the panel tonight. Promotional efforts, coordinated, airports. I always thought that was funny. Why airports? Because intellectual capital doesn't travel by freight or rail or steamship or even car. It's airports. So when the vice president says, LaGuardia looks like a third world nation, there is a reason we need to upgrade our airports. Telecommunications infrastructure, the whole idea of broadband being a critical utility as much as electricity. Quality of life, which I want to talk about, and support for regulatory entities.
Was that list in any sort of order? Was that actually prioritized or arbitrary?
Yeah, no, I don't know. You could look. I included the URL, and I'm going to provide the slides that will be up on the final version of the video for the presentation. You could check. I don't know that it is. I think the most important thing is the workforce, and Mayor Bloomberg, former Mayor Bloomberg, was well known for saying talent attracts capital better than capital attracts talent. And when he recognized a shortage in the applied sciences, did a long-term effort to create like Cornell Tech. So I think people are incredibly important. So that's some background and history on New York City. When you talk about an ecosystem, I just thought, again, to lay the framework for the discussion and what do these things mean, I thought I would share this slide. I just presented this earlier in the month in London. And this is a model, and I don't mean to sound very academic, even though I'm a professor and we're at an Institute of Technology, but this was adopted from Babson. And I just want to point out, it has a lot of those same things, associations, like Disruptive Techs, foundations, support orgs, media, investors, financing, government, education institutions, corporations. I think there's something missing, but I thought you might get a kick out of this. I presented on a panel with someone from Harvard representing Cambridge and some people from Scandinavia and all over the world. It was at this global conference. So they asked for New York City's ecosystem, which I had to present. So you see under strengths, center of the known universe. The only gap I could think of was modesty. And the unique identifiers, again, things like the 2008 financial crisis, which I mentioned, leading to Silicon Alley 2.0, a comprehensive strategy, not just cutting some red tape or, putting in some business plan competitions or some tax breaks, but a whole comprehensive strategy from cutting red tape to Cornell, NYC Tech, which is going to, be decades and billions of dollars. It's a center of many traditional industries ripe for disruption. If you look at so many things here, from law and media, education, finance, they're all being disrupted. And we have a lot of really bright people in those industries. And lastly, this idea of perceptions of desirability. So what are these perceptions of desirability that are not in this model that I think is incredibly important, especially for New York City? So I alluded to the mid-1970s as a kind of lousy time in New York City. If you recognize the above picture, that's the meatpacking district when they used to pack meat. I remember when my early days on Wall Street going to the cattle and making sure the limousine waits outside because you don't want to be standing outside. And here it is now, the lower picture of the meatpacking district, the hottest place, number,
My
you know,
mother lived 9 blocks north of the meatpacking district when I was growing up there.
Yeah, and now
I was
it's,
5 in 1975.
I was a little bit older, they were a little bit older too. But there was meat, cattle hanging up in sawdust on the ground. But anyway, that's what it is now. Another example. So now you can see that the perception of desirability increased tremendously. What about this? You know, way back 1909, I think this was obviously the Flatiron Building. You know, then, so that was a big hub of modern office building. I think first with, you know, I think that's steam elevators or something. My father actually had an office there a long time ago. But, you know, in the 70s and 80s, and up to the 90s, where did everybody want to be? In a glass and steel skyscraper in Midtown Manhattan. Now where does everybody want to be? Down in Silicon Alley in a pre-war, you know, industrial building with, you know, big wood floors and bricks. It's those changes in perception that I think are very important for our ecosystem and inflection points. So I'll just leave this up in case you want to do anything with social media, but let me ask a few questions of the panel. I mean, now that we, you know, talked about what you know, the tech ecosystem is and social infrastructure and inflection points, let me start with David. David, do you think we are at an inflection point now in our ecosystem, whether it's because of the change in, you know, the mayor from Bloomberg to De Blasio, to, you know, the stock market possibly being overvalued? Are we in a tech bubble? Are we at an inflection point here?
I think we are at an inflection point, but for different reasons.
I think we don't have microphones.
We here?
Can you guys hear in the back? Oh, okay, sorry. Just wanted to.
And actually, I'm sorry, as a matter, can I ask you to introduce yourself?
Sure.
You probably read the background, but let me ask, before we go into the question, David and then Chaz to introduce themselves.
Sure. My name is David S. Rose. I am a serial entrepreneur turned serial angel investor, turned a bunch of other things along the way. I was tech in New York before tech was cool, as it were. I started my first tech company in New York City in 1983, before about half this audience was born, which was the computer classroom, did corporate training in super advanced technologies like VisiCalc and Lotus 123 and Microsoft Word 1.0. I then started my first software company in New York in 1988. Which did wireless messaging software, and that morphed into a company called Ex Machina, then Air Media, the first wireless internet broadcasting network, and that got really, really big, hit the dot-com boom. Long story, takes about 2 hours to tell, suffice to say, got really big, crashed and burned, got really big again, got even bigger, crashed and burned even harder, got wiped out in the dot-com crash. At that point, I was grounded from doing any more company starting by my spouse, who said enough is enough. So I became an angel investor, joined the New York New Media Association's Angel Investor Group. Most of you don't remember NINMA. NINMA was the precursor to what is now New York Tech Meetup, or the equivalent for that time. Back in the dot-com boom, it had about 8,000 members, which was pretty enormous for an tech organization. And I was one of the founding members of that back in 95 or thereabouts. So that had an angel program. So I joined that, made some angel investments. Then the Tech Association went bankrupt in the dot-com boom. Those were very bad times for anybody involved in the whole dot-com world. But eventually things recovered. And what is causing the inflection point now is that in the early days of technology, tech was tech. It was a very small industry, and it was chip fab plants, and it was wet labs, and it was people initially doing the functional hardware of computers, and then it moved, because computers were such an arcane, bizarre thing. You would have computers in a giant room, and a lot of the stuff was outsourced, so it became a lot of sort of back office enterprise stuff. So the chip fab factories and stuff happened in California. Then a lot of the enterprise stuff happened in Boston. New York had no indigenous tech population at all. But when I started my first software company in '88 in New York, a few years later, Red Herring magazine described me as the patriarch of Silicon Alley here in New York. It's very easy to be a patriarch if there's no family running around behind you. The grand total of tech companies in New York at that point was Voyager, which was Bob Stein's company that did laser discs. You don't even remember what laser discs are. IBM and Armonk and me. I mean, with my little 3 or 4 little programmers in New York. Not a big tech industry. You talk to yourself at breakfast. But so there was nothing in New York. And then when the internet began to happen, it was really this cool, exciting thing. And so everybody dashed in. New York is a city of money and excitement and all kinds of stuff. People started with the whole NIMBY thing, building tech companies, but there was no infrastructure, no background, no support, ecosystem. All those things you just saw up there were as applied to technology, were non-existent. And so sort of like an alcohol fire that burns very quickly but very fast with no roots. When the dot-com crash happened, so the New York tech community started and realistically began growing in the mid to late 90s. So by 2000, you had less than 4 or 5 years of growth before the whole world came to a crashing halt, which many of you still weren't there in 2000 during the dot-com crash, and that was because there was no, unlike California, which was affected very, very heavily because lots of tech companies, but they had the ability to be resilient and come right back because there was lots of infrastructure. New York didn't. But we had just enough at that point, just enough people who had been through and started companies. A couple of companies like DoubleClick and so on had exited. You had pundits like Esther Dyson. You had some of the early stage VCs like Alan Patrikoff and so on. And there was just enough there so that when the world began to right itself in 2002, 2003, 2004, we had the makings of an industry. And then things began to happen. They began to grow. New York Angels, which I founded in 2004, began to do investments, and a lot of people came out of the woodwork. And then an amazing thing happened. At that point, technology, particularly spurred by the internet, which now meant that you could be anywhere, do anything, connect to anybody. Your customers could be anywhere. Your employees could be anywhere. The whole world was now your oyster. And all of a sudden, it meant technology got applied to other businesses. So the tech business wasn't just the tech business of building computers or writing software. It was now technology as an amplifier applied to other businesses. Applied tech, hyphen tech, financial technology, advertising technology. And guess what? New York's the center of the universe, as Bruce said. Hello, here we are, folks. Surprise, surprise. We're sitting here in the world center of finance and advertising and fashion and food and you name it. And so all of a sudden, when every business in the world is now technology-based or technology amplified, and you apply that to the place where all of the customers are and the headquarters of these Fortune 500 companies are and everything else, New York then began to metastasize. And so that's what you're seeing now, which is this whole history of technology brought to bear on everything else. And since New York is the center of everything else, we've had a literal explosion at this inflection point in the tech industry. So the New York Tech Meetup now is 44,000 people. I mean, there were 8,000 at the absolute height of the dot-com boom. There were 8,000 people who belonged to NYMA. With 44,000 in New York Tech Meetup, it's the largest meetup of any kind in the entire world. The fact that everybody is here tonight, the fact you'll see the stuff we're talking about that the city is doing, this is an extraordinary period to be a technologist in New York.
And let me play the role of the TV host. Look, maybe I'm Good. Chaz?
Well, I grew up here, so I'm a born and raised New Yorker. My mother lived in Chelsea. My father lived in the East Village and Lower East Side. I went to high school in Brooklyn. I went to college at NYIT Film School. And my sort of career, my life has taken kind of 2 paths. I got into computing really early. When I was a kid, my dad got me a Radio Shack TRS-80 computer. I don't know, probably
Trash 80.
Trash 80, exactly. And so I kind of played with that, and in high school I monkeyed with a Apple IIe. I taught myself procedural programming. Rewrote a game called Zork. I don't know if anybody remember, but I basically tried to rebuild Zork. And then at the same time, I was also doing film and TV, and my dad was in publishing. And he actually had the first sort of digital publishing kind of company in New York during Silicon Alley. So I very quickly went out to LA. I worked in the film industry for about 5 years. Got hired by Anderson Consulting during the dot-com days to do basically the early days of tech kind of web consulting. Worked with some startups, had a lot of friends who took off to try and start startups. And then eventually found my way back here and worked in advertising as a creative director. And then, I don't know, like, and I'd always been kind of involved and interested in starting companies and just had that kind of thing in me before anybody called in an entrepreneur. And then really, I would say officially around 2008, 2009, I really started to get back into it. And started a company in 2011, and just essentially been just doing that for the past like 4 or 5 years. So I've been starting many different types of companies. So like in 2011, it was a mobile RFID company. Last year, I started essentially what you could consider a kind of brand and product incubator for big brands. And I would say, to me, like any kind of inflection point or any kind of noticeable thing to me are a few things. To me, I'm a big culture guy. So it's just culturally like, what impact does the startup community have on the larger community, like industries that are already here? So for instance, the way we work. Just in general, like when you show up to a party, how many people are actually trying to start companies, or how many investors do you run into, or how many successful entrepreneurs do you run into? That also to me is another sign, because I can tell you, like even in 2009, you could go to these parties, there'd be like a small group, probably your likelihood of running into somebody who's a successful startup founder was probably almost nil. WeWork and all of these kind of co-working spaces hadn't really taken off yet. So if you think about it, it's been really recent, I would say in the past, really since 2009, since the crash, that co-working's taken off. So the whole idea behind that's actually driven a change in how big companies think about working. So for instance, in about 1.5 years ago, I was running social media for BlackBerry globally. And the way that we worked was very similar to the way that a startup would work. So all the stuff around doing product strategy and growth strategy and all the things that startups have to do were being applied to a lot of the things that we were doing for BlackBerry. And that's a huge change when the activities and the knowledge and the things that you do in order to start a company, to acquire customers, to retain those customers, to grow your revenue, to make your numbers, all that stuff, when it then goes back into kind of incumbent industries like advertising or fashion or whatever, and they start to adapt those processes, so like lean startup and all that stuff, that to me is a sign. That to me says that these industries that before really didn't care about us, in other words, like tech has classically been a supporting industry. It's been much more horizontal than a vertical. Like in Silicon Valley, it's a vertical. You know, there's a mythos that exists around that. I don't know if anyone's seen a documentary called Something Venture, but if you haven't, it's really incredible.
You must. It is one of the great movies of the last couple of years.
It's
the
amazing.
Whole history of venture capital.
And it's amazing because what it really like shows is, you know, outside of an infrastructure about how you work or how people make money or jobs, it really shows that what's important is this culture, is this sense that and it's a noticeable culture. It's the same thing with Hollywood, right? If you really want to be in the movie business and be successful, you move to LA. And so the question is, to be in the tech industry, are people saying, you know what, I actually need to move to San Francisco to be in the tech industry? Or are we at a point where people actually don't need to do that actually they can do that here just as successfully or even more successfully? That to me is the litmus test.
No, and that whole culture and what I call the perceptions of desirability are so important. When I spoke to some foreign journalists at the U.S. mission to the UN, on what they call foreign press tour, and I showed a little clip of the Justin Timberlake movie Friends with Benefits, when Mina Kunis's character is trying to convince him to come to New York, out of the West Coast, Silicon Valley, and finally it was that idea, like, yeah, New York is a great place to be. There's been a lot of quotes by from the founder of Tumblr on why New York City is such a great place to live. And the early talk and research was around how do we recreate Silicon Valleys, and that's kind of has been passé. Now it's like, what do we do? We're not going to recreate a Silicon Valley. That had a unique path. But what are we doing in New York and so many other cities now? Because as the world competes globally, all these cities, you see it in London, where I just came from, Japan, they've been in a recession for 2 decades because they're not very entrepreneurial. They competed on efficiency, and the gains in efficiency are competed away to the customer in the form of lower prices. But Germany, the movement going on in Berlin, South America, Chile, Scandinavia, Finland, they're all trying to figure out what should our tech ecosystem look like. And one thing with inflection points, they could be very positive, even from something negative. The 2008 financial crisis came something positive. But you could also see how a shift in perception, again, those 2 pictures of the meatpacking industry, can change. A few high-profile crimes where some young, tech programmers, something happens and, graffiti comes back and whatever else, how quickly that could change. So, why culture is so important. I mean, you look at places, like Chelsea Lowry's Village, Hoboken, whatever, first the, restaurants and galleries come in and people, that found companies wanted to be in a place that they want to live. So, to get back to the question I started with, David, what do you see as some of the things where we may be at an inflection point now, or that we are at an inflection point here in New York City now?
You just take a look at the total number of startups happening. I mean, the advent of technology is growing at an exponential pace. It is getting every year. How many people here have heard of or read Ray Kurzweil's book, The Singularity is Near? Anybody heard of it? Okay. If you are interested in being a disruptive technologist, that's sort of the Bible of this. It's called The Singularity is Near by a guy named Ray Kurzweil, who is currently director of research at Google, he is a prodigy. He invented the optical scanner. He invented the digital keyboard for rock bands. He invented the word reader for the blind, braille reader for the blind. Presidential Medal of Science, Level Prize at MIT, extraordinary guy. He wrote this book called The Singularity is Near, which is one of several books he wrote. The previous one was called The Age of Spiritual Machines, in which he posits that Moore's Law. Anybody here know about Moore's Law? Raise your hand if you know about Moore's Law. Most people here. Moore's Law said that Gordon Moore from Intel said that they had found the number of chip equivalents, the number of transistor equivalents you could fit onto an integrated circuit was doubling every 18 months. And this held true for something like 20 years, 25 years. And it was amazing. You kept doubling, from 2 to 4 to 8 to 16 all the way up. And so what Kurzweil did was to try and normalize that and say, if you take it away from physical transistors on a chip, but you say say instructions per second per dollar, so you can normalize across different technologies, how far back does that go? And he took that back to the beginning of the 20th century. And if you take a look at Herman Hollerith, who invented punch cards with IBM, going from punch cards to relays to vacuum tubes to transistors, integrated circuits. Every time you get to the height of one technology, these are a series of overlapping S-curves. Another technology comes in and takes you up to another generation. And so Kurzweil pretty convincingly proved that the equivalent of Moore's Law, or this exponential growth of technology, advancement of technology, has been happening since the 20th century. And then he went one step further and said, well, geez, it went back that far. How far back beyond that did it go? And so Singularity is Near is a pretty thick book, but it's full of all kinds of really good scholarship. And he tracked every list of the great advancements in human history, back to the beginning of recorded time and so on. And it turns out, and he will prove it, objectively prove it, you can take a look at it in the book, that this has held true since the beginning of the planet. If you go from single-cell organisms to the iPhone 6, you are talking about effectively an unbroken exponential technological curve. It's called a power curve. Now you say, how the hell can that happen? Why didn't we have an iPhone 6 back in 2300 BC? And the answer is, if you graph this stuff and you start from a tiny little bit, right, 0.001, and you double it, you get 0.002, and the incremental change is only 0.001, which you can't see, right? And the next incremental change is 0.002. then 0.004, you still can't see it. So if you graph this stuff up over time, you end up with a curve that looks like this. It's called a power curve. Slow, 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 slow. Then all of a sudden, you begin to get to like 1, and then 2, 4, 8, 16, 30, 16, 20, 22, 23, 24, 24. It looks, 1 gigabyte, 2 gigabyte, 4 gigabyte, terabyte, blah, 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 and it looks like zoing.
Like the
that.
NASDAQ chart I put up earlier.
Very much so, until it went over the cliff. And so if you look at things like the population of the planet, go take a look, go pull up Wikipedia global population, and you will see a power curve. It starts like this for 100,000 years. You had people like this, like this, like this, like this. Then you get to the mid-20th century, and all of a sudden, zoing, you go and now the population of the world is doubling. That's another power curve. So Kurzweil looks at this and says, geez Louise, if you look at areas in which we are advancing technologically, whether it is computing power, computing speed, computing storage, the cost of computing storage, whether it is the communications connectivity, whether it is our ability to do things at nanoscale or microscale, whether it's our understanding of the human genome or the human neural network, you put all these things together, and what's the next logical S-curve here? The next paradigm shift. And he makes a very convincing case that the next paradigm shift is when humans and computers merge. So you either have computers that can think, or you have humans who are plugged into computers. Can we say the Matrix, anybody? But at that point, when you have computers designing the next generation of computers, what the hell happens? And the answer is nobody knows. I mean, right now, imagine somebody walking in here with all the knowledge of Wikipedia and all the ability to communicate everywhere in the world. Hello, look at this thing, right? This is Gaia. This is the global store of all knowledge. This connects to the global connectivity of everything. It has a microphone so it can hear you. It has a camera so it can see you. It has a speaker to screen so it can play it back to you. It has a GPS sensor so it knows where you are. It has positional sensors so it knows what you're doing. So you are now connected to the whole global world. Now what happens when this ends up getting implanted here or something or other, right? Not that far off, whether it's Google Glass or whatever here. So so Kurzweil's projection for when this is going to happen, this human and computers merging, 2045. We are now, in case you were wondering, on the cusp of 2015. So you are talking about 30 years from now. I would posit that every single person in this room is going to be alive in 30 years. And so for some of you young ones, it'll be when you're entering your prime working years over there. So what happens when this singularity happens? Werner Bing coined the term of singularity, and the answer is, who the hell knows? It's beyond our event horizon. I mean, the idea of humans and computers merging and the ability of computers to design computers that humans like NYIT can't even touch is so far beyond our ability to comprehend, where that power curve goes like this, that it changes everything. And we are now in the beginnings of this happening, when technology is applied to all these industries in every way. I was talking to my younger brother about the advanced pace of technology, and he was saying, oh yeah, well, it affects my business too. And I said, Gideon, you're a policy wonk. He's the editor of Foreign Affairs magazine. I said, how is this technology affecting you? He says, well, when I'm talking to a 4-star general, and he says he learned about the latest events in Israel and the Palestinian territories from a Twitter feed 4 hours before the brass at the Pentagon, you can tell that something serious is changing. So you're now seeing all this stuff applied to everywhere.
Thank you, David. So Chaz, David talked about a big picture inflection point with technology.
That's a very...
As you here in New York City, and especially as you talked about how you're born and raised here and how important culture is, do you see inflection points here in New York City, things that are about to change?
Yeah,
for better or for worse? For
me, I look at it like, sort of on a kind of more human scale than that, which is, so how many people here are involved in a startup? Okay. How many people have friends who are involved in startups? Okay. How many people are actually, if they're making money, they're getting paid from working in a startup? Okay. So the last question of how many people work at startups and are actually getting paid, they actually have gainful employment, is it's not very sexy, but it's one of the things that I would say we should look at, because the kind of viability of the startup community and an industry in particular is how many people can be employed within that industry. How viable is it that people can actually make a living? Now, it's not always the case, because obviously the whole point of a startup is risk. But if 100% of everybody who's trying to start a company if none of them are making money, none of them are making revenue, they're not getting funded, there is no industry. So that is the kind of biggest question for me, is because it really does influence how many other people then go, then I should take a shot at that, right? If we go to a party and nobody's making money, and everybody's like, yeah, I'm fucking broke, I've been eating ramen for the past 5 years. I mean, that is part of the thing. But if everybody's doing that, then how likely are you to actually try and start a company? Because it's painful. I mean, starting companies is like, I would not recommend it unless you have to. I think you have to sort of be a little demented to do it. But at the same time, it is true that I think you need to have some kind of temperature check to say, yeah, you know what, for me, it's a viable option. Because otherwise, we do have incumbent industries. We have fashion, we have advertising, we have publishing, we have finance. And those businesses typically is where most of the employment happens. So to get engineers to leave JP Morgan Chase and to work at your startup, those startup companies need to be more viable for those engineers to go, yeah, I'm going to take a risk, because the risk is, while it's still great, it's not completely insane.
But the interesting thing about this is that because of this advancing technology that's applying to everything, I would posit that any company that was designed for success in the 20th century is doomed to failure in the 21st. Because they will simply not be able to compete. And you're beginning to see this now across industries. Look at the airline industry, right, which was designed in the 20th century with a whole direct flights, not hub and spoke, and unionized, everything from the business models to the technology to the underlying whole systems. That's why every single friggin' major airline went bankrupt, and they now have to shed themselves of their contracts and their routes and their everything else to make this work. Look what Uber is doing to the taxi industry in the space of a few short years. How do you get from 0 to $17 billion in value in less than 5 years? I mean, they are completely disrupting things. And so therefore, all these people who were working before in the fashion industry and the advertising industry and so on and so forth, they are now, you're now looking, okay, can I do really interesting, exciting stuff in an ad firm, or am I going to do my own startup and sell to the ad firm? I mean, New York is the home of advertising technology, which is all this tech applied to the clients who are already sitting there.
The whole area of creative destruction is very interesting, and that was kind of the grandfather of entrepreneurship. Talked about the same way Darwin talked about, right, survival of the fittest. But I think that your analogy with looking at employment is incredibly important, because in the end, you pay the bills, and as someone teaching and seeing students come out of university and look for a job. The whole employment scene has changed so much from a generation ago when I graduated. Virtually every net new job in the past 2 decades has been created by firms less than 4 years old with under 100 employees. If you look at how many companies are on the S&P 500, how many of them are still there? 14%?
47 out of the Fortune 500 companies, Fortune 500 list, only 47 were on the list when it first came out.
And if you look at the Dow Jones Industrial Average, right, virtually none. And the companies that will be around are those that are able to reinvent themselves. So if you look at companies like IBM, there's all this stuff coming out on IBM now. Back in the early 90s, they were almost bankrupt, right? And then C.L. Lewis v. Gerstner wrote the book Elephants Can Dance. One of the models I talked about earlier, David Birch, he talked about 3 types of companies. Mice, little small businesses that don't matter. Gazelles, those high growth companies. And elephants, big lumbering companies that don't create jobs. And it's really interesting to see those companies that are able to reinvent themselves and what they have to do to reinvent themselves. Also what students need to do, coming out to get a job. It's just how important the job as a figure of viability. Are we at a bubble of sustainability? I think is probably the best measure. And if you look at some charts in New York City at various industries, almost all of them have negative growth, except for the tech and startup industry has had some great growth, and there's some great figures on NYC EDC site, as well as
Well,
I'm sure many
if-
others.
If you think about this world, when my first company was one of 4 tech companies in New York, today, many of you know that I run a company called GUST, which is the platform for global entrepreneurship, connecting entrepreneurs and investors. In New York City alone, there are over 15,000 startup companies with profiles on GUST. 15,000, and there weren't 15 of them 20 years ago. Talk about an inflection point in a power curve, that's what you're looking at.
And if they are, as I said, able to earn money, and speaking of this guy, I mean, again, it's not, I think Charles Handy decades ago predicted this whole change in employment where you're going to have multiple part-time jobs, or be your own freelancer, your own entrepreneur, et cetera. And when he was a British futurist and economist. I think he founded the London School of Business. But when his son was graduating college and asked for advice, he said, look for customers, not bosses. So in other words, don't look for a boss, just tell me what I could do. Tell me what to do and I'll do it in return for a paycheck. What do I have that's of value? How can I create value and do that? And it's interesting to see that perception of entrepreneurship in general, especially among college campuses, the fastest growing major across the country, take off. A generation ago, they say, if you said you want to do into entrepreneurship, they'd send you to counseling. If you couldn't get a good job or in a good university, you might go into entrepreneurship. Now it's very, very different.
When I got my MBA at Columbia University in the city of New York, there was not one single class or program with the word entrepreneur in the title. Not one.
So a lot of people credit the first class in 1947 at Harvard. TASE's program actually started in 1979. At the time, there was about 24 courses in entrepreneurship. So it's interesting to see the shift now. And again, that whole perception of desirability for what students want to go into, what companies have to do in New York City. Let me go on. Looking at New York City, what makes our social fabric and tech ecosystem unique? You talked about people before having to go out to the West Coast. My dentist son created a startup. He lived in Dobbs Ferry. He felt he had to go out to the West Coast, and he started Facebook, and it worked out really well for him. But does everyone have to go out? So what makes our ecosystem and social fabric unique? Not better or worse, but just unique. Chaz?
I just think we have access to different stuff. Like you said, we do have industries here that make us probably more qualified to actually disrupt some of the industries that are here because we're closer. I worked in advertising as a creative director for years, and I know people in fashion, and so there are a couple things. One is there's just a broader mix of people, I think. To me, I just think it's more interesting. I just think the sort of more varied people that you have, you just
cross-pollination.
Yes, cross-pollination of ideas. And honestly, there have been dozens of times where I'm stuck on some problem, or I'm trying to think of how to crack something, and somebody from a completely different industry, I talk to them, and I apply some piece of knowledge that they have to whatever problem I'm trying to solve, and you sort of create this kind of unique way of cracking problems because you're taking basically knowledge from other industries. And I think that when you talk about creative disruption, to me, that's what creative disruption is you solve what seem like conventional problems in incredibly unconventional ways.
Right.
And that, I think, is what New York is awesome at.
I think so. In some of the shared workspaces or incubators, what makes them great is not the features they have, the location, it's the mix of people in those incubators. Dave, yes?
Yeah, I was just to comment that I think another piece of the puzzle is that a lot of overseas startups in Europe, the first stop that they make if they want to come to the United States is New York. Eventually, they think about moving their headquarters to San Francisco, but their first stop is New York, and I think that gives an interesting kind of cross-cultural mix. There's a lot of young people or people who started, like I said, coming here, and trying to set up their sales offices here, or get their initial investment here, and I think that creates a unique flavor. I think in Silicon Valley, it's probably people coming from China and India who started something maybe, but here it's mostly from Europe and Israel and so on that come to New York.
Even with But either look at, like you see the map in New York, you could see, just Israeli companies as just one example here. APACE got 3 new grants. One was to train veterans in entrepreneurship from Blackstone, and we have some of the participants here tonight. The second one was someone, not even an alum, just wants to give money to students to test their ideas, proof of concept. And the third one is an alum who donated $1 million, $250,000, just to bring Israeli companies here and let our students work with them, because New York is where they want to be. Did you have a comment?
Okay, there's been a lot of discussion of the decline of the middle class in New York City.
Right.
And the middle class encompasses artists, musicians, and a lot of the knowledge workers who work in these industries. And most importantly, that kind of diversity is very, very conducive to the kind of creative problem-solving Chaz was talking about, where you can meet somebody who has a very different viewpoint who you can interact with. So the question is, what can be done to address the increasingly high cost of living, the problems with affordable housing and related issues that's causing an exodus and actually causing a lot of people to leave the area and actually move to less less dense, lower cost of living areas outside of the city.
No, and I think that's something we have to look at with inflection points. And on that topic, with Digital.NYC, I saw the launch of it. I think you could get online. David spoke, and one of the things the mayor is talking about, without trying to be at all political, is there's this perception, okay, is he Robin Hood, rob from the rich and give to the poor, and maybe kill the golden, the goose that laid the golden eggs that create all this, or is it a more equitable distribution that's not just limited to some very wealth creation to a limited number of people in Manhattan? And by holding the event in Brooklyn and bringing in people like Majorca from Sustainable South Bronx, et cetera, I think it's a very important question. If you just look at what made America great through the 50s and 60s, a robust middle class, right? Started by Ford paying his workers, what was it, $10 a day, double what anyone else made, and how important a middle class is. So I think that's an inflection point. Do we get, again, this is not me speaking, but the commercial, do we get back to the mid-70s, the graffiti on the subways and crime-ridden everything, and future presidential candidates going to the South Bronx to film their ad? Or do we have this whole renaissance of a middle class and a whole creator industry?
And that's probably a great lead-in. So why don't I show them what Digital.NYC is all about?
Okay, and while you're bringing that up, let's take this question.
I would also point out that problem doesn't exist in a vacuum. If the competitive city that you're aiming at is, for instance, San Francisco isn't exactly a bargain basement town either. No one can afford to live in San Francisco. South of the Bay, and even east of the Bay, have become very, very expensive and difficult for a middle class and a technological class and creative class to live in too. Where New York has the advantage of it is frankly a public transportation network that allows people to live further out from the city center and congregate closer in with each other. Gets people out of their cars, gets people in and mixing with each other.
So that was actually one of the centerpieces of the discussion around the launch of Digital.NYC. And so what Bruce was referring to was at the beginning of this month, on October 1st, the mayor and a cast of thousands, or a cast of hundreds at least, went to Dumbo, just outside of Brooklyn Heights, to introduce an amazing new platform called Digital.NYC, which is, as you will see, the centerpiece for the entire New York City tech startup digital community. And so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to show you the opening film that opened the press conference, and then I'll give you a quick tour of the site, and then we're happy to talk about it. Okay? So here we go.
New York City is the fastest growing tech startup community in the world.
New York City is the most dynamic, dense, creative, exciting, diverse city in the country.
One of the biggest benefits of New York City is the diversity of what's happening here. There's fashion, there's art, finance.
So much of the tech scene touches every industry in New York City.
New York is a place where people come and they get stuff done.
People here are building real businesses that affect real people.
New York City has always been the most exciting place in the world to start a business. That's not new news. Digital.NYC is a public-private partnership. It's really the first time anybody has connected all the pieces of the tech ecosystem.
Bigger than the sum of our community when you know that the government and the mayor have your back. As a startup founder, people that I meet are constantly asking me, where can I find a list of all the best startups in the city? It's going to be real-time, active. We're actually bringing together the tech ecosystem into one place.
Digital.NYC really enables that growth by creating community.
New York City is making Digital.NYC the connective tissue for the entire tech community of New York City.
That it would be this awesome portal as a way to kind of bring folks together so that we are in fact a community.
Digital.NYC is something that we need.
Wow, I wish that existed when we were first starting.
They've done a lot of legwork for you.
Truly, as a New Yorker, I couldn't be prouder of my city and more excited about the future.
News, startups,
Events,
Jobs,
investors,
Resources,
maps, courses,
workspaces,
incubators,
accelerators, videos.
blogs.
It's all here in one place. That's Digital.NYC.
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 New York City's hub for tech and startups.
So let me show you. So let me show you what was actually announced. So how many people here have actually been to Digital.NYC? Raise your hand. Okay, about a third of the audience. All right, so for those of you who haven't, here's what you missed, but you can get on the bandwagon like everybody else, and the minute you leave here or pick up from your iPhone, go take a look. It's Digital.NYC, literally .NYC, not Digital.NYC.com. It's literally Digital.NYC.
And I started recently Meetup.NYC. So if you go on Meetup and look up .NYC, we discuss .NYC, and if you want to start a business on it or
So New York City is the first city in the world to get its own top-level domain, just like .com or .org or .mil. It's .NYC, and it's restricted to companies that are people that are based in New York City. So one of the very, very first of the sites to be deployed on the .NYC domain is Digital.NYC, which, as the sign so nicely says, is NYC's home for tech and startups. So this is just the home page of the site. If you want to know what's going on and you want access to everything in the city of New York's tech world, this is it. And so you come here, bookmark this, and come here multiple times a day. You'll see news. You'll see the old mapped, We Are Mapped in New York site has now been expanded here. So it's not just a question of a few companies. It's now everything happening in the city. You've got all of the events and videos and the whole bit. So this is lead in to the rest of the site. So let me quickly walk you through what you will find here, right? So you start with the map. The digital map is for places. We are mapped in NY, which will now redirect to this site. And instead of just companies, it's thousands of, this is now thousands of startups here, plus events and jobs and everything else. You've got, let me pass. You've got every startup in the city. And how many people know that there are startups listed on here? Raise your hand if your startup is here. Got it. If you have a startup or you're in a startup and it's not here, you can submit it yourself. And you got a whole profile where people can find you. It's great for discovering. We are finding most of the clicks here are for people who are looking for startups. You have got all the investor organizations, angel groups, and venture funds. You've got all the events, a single coordinated calendar for everything happening, searched by industry, by neighborhood, by you name it. It's got all the jobs, coordinated job platform on here. It's got all the courses, classes from a host of different organizations, Flatiron, General Assembly, and the like. I'm sure it's got PACE in there. You've got all the workspaces and co-working spaces, the incubators and accelerators, all the resources for starting a company and finding meetups and the like. You have all the community organizations. You have daily updated, multiple times a day, every news story about what's happening in New York City. You have all of the blogs from every bloggers you've heard about, like Fred Wilson, and the ones you haven't. It's got all the tweets, all pulled into one place. If you're into video and you don't like to read, it's got every video in the whole startup world over here. So basically, this is what the site is all about, Digital.NYC. And if you want to know about have we hit an inflection point, this is, I think, the absolute proof positive that we've got an inflection point, because no place else in the world could feel this kind of an ecosystem.
Who's not actually ever subscribed to Gary's Guide?
Hey, Gary Sharp.
Okay, so Gary's Guide was one of the ways that you used to figure out what the hell was going on from week to week, right? Which was, I mean, outside of this room probably not a lot of people knew about it. So what's good about stuff like this is it takes this idea of entrepreneurship and the startup community out of the startup community and into the rest of the New York world as it is, because that really is what needs to
And I can tell
happen.
you, that half the clicks from this are coming from outside of New York City, which is pretty amazing.
And we are the featured event today, right here. We have a really cool group. So let's go back. I think it was, we were leaving, last discussing, are we at an inflection point and what makes, New York unique in both the social fabric and the tech ecosystem. Let me ask what you think some of the biggest challenges, pressing challenges, where we're looking at some of the biggest risks we face, both in the tech ecosystem and in the social fabric of New York City. So you mentioned some things like the rising costs of living here. It's always been expensive, as pointed out, many other cities are. But what do you think some of the big challenges and risks we face here in New York are, Chaz?
I think, well, just as sort of a guy who's just all over the place, hanging out with so many different people, is just kind of like a clear path to, okay, I have some idea, I want to build a thing, I want to start a company around it, I want to hire people, all the things you need to actually legitimately try and create a business, grow a business, get funded, and all that stuff, has been kind of haphazard and fragmented. So I think one of the things that has always been a challenge for people is the amount of time it just takes to get in there and just learn how to do all that stuff. So like one example is, I was hanging out with somebody the other day and we were talking about basically growth marketing. And there's just like a lot of really basic knowledge about like, okay, practically what are the things I need to do and at what stage, right? And there's, this stuff exists, right? People have done this before, but it's typically been really hard to figure out like, so what am I supposed to do first? How do I know when I have product market fit? When am I actually supposed to turn on the machine, the growth machine? Like those are they're very non-sexy, but they're actually some of the most important stuff to actually start a company and build a company, run a company, get it funded, all that stuff. So I think those things have been the sort of exchange of knowledge, the easy flow of knowledge from people who have done it before, or people like him who have funded a lot of companies. That kind of needs to trickle down fast, and there needs to be like a really clear way that people can get at that information, because you just you'll hang out at the wrong place and you can go down a road for like 6 months and then realize like, oh, I actually missed like a really important step and I've just been floundering for like 6 months. And that doesn't have to do with these macro trends, but it actually kind of makes a difference to the frustration that people have and the feeling that they're like, well, there's no single place that I can go that somebody can say, look, do this first and then do that and then concentrate on that. It's kind of like Paul Graham. It's why people go to Y Combinator, because he can just save people a lot of time and money. He can just tell them, look, like, you're wasting your time with this. You don't actually have product market fit. There's no point in trying to grow your customer. You don't actually know, you're not retaining customers. And, like, there's just really basic shit that you have to know.
Yeah.
And that has to get out to people so that people don't keep making the same mistakes over and over and over again. And that's what creates
Who
like...
did come out?
Huh?
Derek Lidow, whose book Startup Leadership came out last year.
Yeah.
He takes you through all those
Yeah.
stages. He sold his company for $100 million.
Yeah.
So it's there.
It's there. I think it's just people finding out about it. All this stuff is there in some form or another.
Well,
but
he really took the time to really
Yeah.
break it down in stages.
Yeah.
And if you look at, not to plug books, but Eric Ries's The Lean Startup, I think what the really interesting thing for me, who teaches both strategy, corporate strategy to regular business people, and then entrepreneurship, that lean thinking, minimal viable product, pivot, experiment, test, all these things like 3-day startup, the lean machine, there really are neat, and it's changing the way kids think. And again, that perception, not that long ago, people wanted to work, for Fortune 500 companies in New York City. 85% of jobs now, virtually nothing. Net, they haven't created jobs. looking at that, and that people, including students, are willing to take those risks. And we talked about all the industries in New York, like EdTech or creating Cornell NYC Tech. Remember, Bloomberg was challenged on, oh, you're not going to create an educational center here in New York City. That belongs to Boston. And an interesting fact is that New York City has more college students than Boston has people. So, no universe. David?
You say that, but after you get out the t-shirts, that would have been awesome.
Yeah, I want
to. So I think that in terms of developing an ecosystem and everything needed for it, New York has really done an amazing job. I mean, as somebody who's been around for forever, to watch what has happened in New York over the last couple of decades has truly been fascinating. It's not just the technology, but it's the emergence of all of the accelerator programs and incubators and WeWork and General Assembly and Flatiron School and New York Tech. We have all these things coming together, which means it is now really, really easy to start a company. And if you are looking to start a company and you don't know what these steps are, that's your problem, frankly. I mean, no, seriously. Between Steve Blank's guide, between Eric Ries, between the book you mentioned, between Brad Bell's series on Startup CEO, between the 4,000 free classes, between General Assembly and meetups. I mean, you have to be deaf, mute, and blind to not be able to figure out. Hell, my core answers. I got a little empathy. 3,000 answers. How do I start a company? Do A, B, C, D, and E, right? So this is not rocket science, and if you are literally deserving of being an entrepreneur, you can figure out exactly what to do. I think it's important, but I don't think that is particularly the problem. I think I tend to think of the big societal level things, and so I think the big societal issue, which is the challenge for New York as well as everywhere else, is not starting a company, because as I said, 15,000 on Gus right now. Everybody in this room, everybody in New York Tech Meetup, all starting companies. The challenge facing society, I believe, is what do we do with the 90% of those that fail? If you have 1,000 entrepreneurs starting companies, the metrics say half of them will fail within the first year, and more than half within 2 years. And in terms of getting financing, angels finance 2.5% of companies looking for financing. VCs finance 0.25%. That's 1 out of 400 companies, right? And so for many of these startup companies, you can only bootstrap so far. And if you can't get financing, you can't get it from customer financing. And by the way, there are a lot of books now on how to get customer financing, how to bootstrap. Then you're out of business and you stop. And you put in 6 months, a year, 2 years of your blood, sweat, and tears, your life into this company. You have learned how to get a company started. You're now no longer a virgin first-time entrepreneur. You're now a serial entrepreneur if you start something again. So you learned, you put energy in there, you got to figure out what the steps are, you've made contacts, you've made networks. It didn't succeed, but okay, now what? Now the challenge for us as an ecosystem and a society is how do we leverage that? How do we take that extraordinary stick-to-itiveness and entrepreneurial activity and experience now learned by those 90% of people who did not succeed in a way that helps society and helps create other companies? That's, I think, our challenge.
Yeah, and when asked about entrepreneurship and whether it's at the university, press things, or outside, I'd like to talk about how the entrepreneurial mindset is so important. Entrepreneurship is much more than just starting a company. It's clearly a very visible manifestation of it and very important and central. But that idea of an entrepreneurial mindset, the ability to recognize, analyze, and capture opportunity to create value. And I think that that's important whether you're in a large company, again, IBM, the whole idea of this new corporate service corps. I talked about the previous book by Luke Gerstner, which talked about corporate entrepreneurship, nonprofits, military, educational institutions. I mean, we're ripe for disruption in colleges and universities. New things like Institute U in New York City Alternative. An institute, there's one, an apprenticeship program, there's so many coming that, so this idea of an entrepreneurial mindset is so important, and I think part of that ecosystem are all the different types of entrepreneurs, whether they're solopreneurs, the freelancers, the Uber taxi drivers who are making their living that way, etc. Airbnb, are you creating value? Uber, from one level up to people like David that are funding so many of these companies, and the role that the city takes. And I think what's really important is strategy is a coherent pattern of action, irreversible commitments, and cohesive action. It's not about one thing, a tax cut, a website, an investor. It's how all these pieces come together, coherently and interdependently. And I think that's something that New York City has done really well. And it's interesting to see what Silicon Valley has done to create that. Another big part of it is with these billion-dollar exits we're getting, they reinvest, in other people, the whole perception. This is something, use one of my favorite words, sexy. This is a sexy thing to do now. Why was it sexy to be a Wall Street banker in 2007? And it's unsexy. You're ashamed to bring your dad to school if he's an investment banker now. So those perceptions change, and I think it's incredibly important.
I think one barrier that New York City has, and is a serious barrier, is the educational system here. There are lots of coders, and if they're not in New York, they're going to be somewhere else, and you can telecommunicate. You can telecommute them in. But if I'm hiring office workers, people who can actually make my business run, and they can't write a business letter, and they don't know how to write an email, and they need to go to community college for 2 years to learn the remedial stuff that they didn't get in high school, that's a big damn problem for New York City.
No, it is. And, as a professor, I can't tell you how many emails I get. Yo, Bruce, all lowercase, from a student. I didn't come to class, I screwed up my calendar. Can you tell me, was anything important done? No, we didn't do anything but watch cat videos on YouTube. And that's college level people are. So I think you're right, and I think when you look at what's going on in places like Finland and some of these other areas, you need that level. And as Dave talked about, if everything, all knowledge is on the Google machine, what are people important for? It's not your skill, it's your innovation, your creativity, your communication skills. So I think you're right. And just to point out, we did leave time for Q&A at 8:15, and we're going to start early to respect the audience.
Okay. So as I look at the Bloomberg administration, they made a really strong push to make New York City the capital, the tech capital of the world. Obviously, with De Blasio administration, with Digital New York City, we've seen that push. I look at your list, Bruce, that you show on that slide, some of the things that, I don't remember every item, that are essential. Talent, there's no lack of talent in New York. Capital, obviously no lack of capital in New York. Infrastructure, that's great. What do the panelists see? That's one thing that's truly lacking in this city that will make a strong push to make it a tech capital to get the world.
Yeah, we've got to improve broadband, right? Across the city. I happen to have lucked out and have great, FiOS there, right? I mean, I clocked my home FiOS last night at 357 megabit upload. I mean, which is like, I'm going like, oh, did I read that correctly? Did I need to do another text? I mean, literally. That's like so bizarre. The fact that it was so bizarre to me is an indication that, and there are a lot of places in New York that have sketchy things. In our office, we were getting, if we got 6 megabit and it was a standard connection, we'd be in good shape. So that's something you want to have. And I think one of the biggest challenges facing the city, and that's what a lot of this Digital.NYC was all about, is diversity in the sense of being able to enfranchise so much of our population. Right now, if you take a look around the tech world in New York, it tends to look a lot like Mark Zuckerberg, right? And so there are a whole lot of people in New York City who don't look like your dentist's son. They are, whether it is people of color or people of different national backgrounds, people of different genders or no gender, whether it is people from different boroughs who aren't in, Soho or the meatpacking district. This is an extraordinarily diversity, more diverse than any place else. And once we can begin to unlock that, by letting people, by both holding up role models, hey, you could be a tech startup. It doesn't take that much, and here's how to do it, here's the places, here's the connectivity, and so on and so forth, and get that going. I would love to see not just Silicon Alley, but Silicon City, so that regardless of what borough you're in, regardless of what neighborhood, or what your affinity group is, that can be part of this whole digital economy.
And one other thing that's missing, and I think is really going to hurt us, and it's nothing New York City could do anything about, but on the national level, is visas. You know, we could give these people a PhD in electrical engineering, computer science, and send them home, or, you know, Canada wants to get them. But if you look at 50% of tech startups have had at least one immigrant, you know, on the founding team, and we're kicking them out. You know, we have people that can't write a basic business letter. So I think things.
Which is actually a very good point. I mean, in terms of all these things on this list over here, New York is really doing damn well. I mean, New York City is today the fastest growing tech ecosystem in the world, period. It's second in size to Silicon Valley, right? But it is growing faster, and it's growing faster than any place else. So we're clearly doing something right, and it's now technology and entrepreneurship and finance applied to all of these centerpieces of industry. And so the challenge for us is how to keep that going.
My big question about that is, when did that exponential growth start for New York?
Well, remember, exponential growth is a power curve, right? And so it was starting when there were, you know, if you take when there were 4, 8, 16, 32. So in reality, we hit the knee of that curve, I think, probably 5 years ago, probably coming out of the, the recession. And that's where everything began to hit the fan.
Yeah, no, and we passed, you know, Boston, Cambridge, and VC startup. Somebody was referencing a book, I'm sorry, I don't remember the book, but they pointed out that the Boston, you know, the first building in Boston was a church, the first building in New York was a pub, the second building was a brothel. I forgot the name of the book, but yes, next question.
Hi, I'm Milan from Metagram. I wanted to follow up on the comment regarding education. I came from Europe, obviously here. I think that the biggest difference between New York City and Europe is that Europe, as you said, like really focuses a lot on education. But what's missing in Europe is that entrepreneurial spirit that's present here in New York City. So I think that New York has the big opportunity to connect those two things.
No, and the problem, they have very high quality, you know, education. I get students from Finland, France, all over Europe, but one of the problems is that there's not that entrepreneurial mindset of people. It's not perceived as a desirable career to go into. Their parents, and also in the academics and by governments. I mean, you know what it takes to set up a company in France. I mean, they have the Minister of Travail. As soon as you get like the 4th employee, your 5th employee does nothing but fill out government forms. And you're not allowed to overtime.
Well, it's interesting. It's just too long to have a discussion about right now. But there is a very interesting question about entrepreneurship, which you study and teach, and have people in this room are. And there is a genetic question about it. A wonderful book called The Hypomanic Edge by John Gartner, which I would encourage everybody to read, which equates entrepreneurship to hypomania, people who sort of act like me. And his point, one of his conclusions is, if you look at the most entrepreneurial thing, what is that? It's to pick up everything, bet your entire life, pick up your family and move across the sea to someplace else entirely. And so therefore he ran entrepreneurial activity by rates of immigration. And if you take a look at the world's most entrepreneurial countries, the U.S., Israel, Australia, so you know, so you can say that there's a genetic thing there. I would take another. I think that's accurate to an extent, but another one is culture, right? So the historical culture, conservative culture in Europe. I mean, in France, we had an office in France, our European office was in France, and I couldn't dare employ anybody, because once you employ them, you're like employed for life, and you have to, I mean, it's insane. So we actually moved to the UK, which is now actively trying to recruit tech companies to come in. Whereas in the case of America, we don't have a history, right? This is a country without any, you can't think back 200 years. And so everything, therefore, is new and fresh. You don't have, 2 millennium worth of tradition in the UK, until very recently, I think actually still now, if your company fails, your startup fails, you're not allowed to start another company for another 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 years.
Yeah, that is still the case.
What the hell kind of incentive is that? Okay, so my kids can be yelled at in school and people can throw stones at me and I cannot start a company? That's completely the opposite. Whereas we have a country that is based on entrepreneurship and based on initiative, Connecticut Yankee, King Arthur's Court, Mark Twain, and so on.
Yes, let me.
I agree with your point, but nevertheless, I think the U.S. has gone to the far right or left. To your earlier, in the middle class, you have to have certain safety nets, and I wish, that technology will help us bridge that gap. I think, immigration has been mentioned, key critical, the working poor community. What do you do about that? How wealth is, sustained by 10% of the population. that's, you know, these are aspects that, you know, I adore: the flexibility, the drive, and the eagerness, and it's all about that energy, and it's extremely positive. Nevertheless, I think, you know, the social systems that Europe brings in are also, you know, through the years proved of a value. So we should, you know, be smarter and meet in the middle.
I think this is a global issue that has not hit home yet with anybody, because the bottom line is, if you follow this exponential, you know, thing of what's happening, you take a look at unemployment and then where are the jobs being lost and which jobs are being gained. You're losing jobs from the bottom. You're losing menial jobs, service jobs, intermediary jobs, middle management jobs, going up from the bottom. And you're going to end up in so I believe that in the future, the not too distant future, you're going to see a world which is composed of entrepreneurs starting companies, like a lot of people in this room, who will make up, what, 1% of the population, 2%, 5%? And then I think you're going to see a whole class of what I could coin entrepreneurial personal producers. This is going to be the barber who puts her thing on Yelp, so she has her reputation managed there, or the coder who goes onto Odesk or Elance to find work and so on and so forth, managing their own careers. And then the other people are going to be unemployed. So the question for all of us as a society is, you know, what percentage of the population is not going to be capable of either being an entrepreneur or managing their whole career as a personal producer? And those people, and I think you may find that's being up to half of the society, which is really, really scary, okay, are going to require a safety net, and nobody in government is talking about that at all, and frankly, not even in Europe, where it's a socialist economy. But, yeah, and that's a challenge, a real challenge.
And I think that, you know, the greatest form of security is your own ability, again, that entrepreneurial mindset. He's a person producer, like I talked about, the person who rents on Airbnb, who puts their work up on Elance, who drives an Uber car, and what Charles Handy predicted, that whole delayering of middle management, multiple part-time jobs based around adding value. If you look at, you know, the first self-made female millionaire in America, is this woman, Madam C.J. Walker. She's the daughter of freed slaves, orphaned at age 7, made 7 cents a day doing laundry. She said, I got my break by giving myself a break. I got my opportunity by giving myself one. So for me, security, I don't want to depend on, you know, the government or a safety net. I can't depend on Social Security. So I think people are going to have to adopt that entrepreneurial mindset. And even in cultures, look at Bangladesh, where women didn't have work and didn't touch money. Look at Mohammed Yunus, you know, the Nobel Peace Prize winner, Grameen Bank. He turned a country into entrepreneurs, but these were women who weren't allowed to work, weren't allowed to touch money to do anything, creating hundreds of thousands. So I think the best security is, you know, that entrepreneurial mindset.
A question, because I think, so I've spent a lot of time with the Brooklyn Navy Yard Development Corp for the past like 12 months, which is right next to Fort Greene and you know, Bed-Stuy and all these communities. And the question I always have is, all this entrepreneurial stuff is awesome, but well, I have two things. One, should everybody, or should we expect everyone to be an entrepreneur?
No.
Is that really fair?
No.
And secondly, all those people, right, they've gone through education. We basically had one education system that says, here's the path. But to actually do, okay, so last year I started this one company, one of my companies, which was me and 2 other guys. I found a client, me and 2 other guys, essentially haphazardly started like a very small, I guess you could call it an agency, where the 3 of us pitched for a piece of work against 9 other big agencies, and won it was like over a $3 million project for 3 dudes who didn't have a bank account. But the question is, to do that kind of thing, you have to have access to a lot of things. You have to have access to the kind of like work that is. So that's you end up doing very project-based work, right? Everybody has a role in a project, so you're a product manager or whatever. So the type of work that is and the type of skills that takes is much different than going up through a classic education system to work in an office for
So the classic education system was, you know, after the Industrial Revolution. Here's a quiz, and we still have 6 minutes. What do these people have in common? Schooling. Bill Gates, Sergey Brin, Larry Page, Mark Zuckerberg and Jeff Bezos. They all went to the same school.
School of Hard Knocks.
Nope.
Stanford.
No, they went to the same school. Harvard.
They all went to public school.
They all learned the stuff that you're talking about, project-based learning, not being divided by years. They all went to Montessori. And Larry Page and Sergey Brin completely credit Montessori with their success. It's a completely different way of learning.
Now, just to add on to that, I just had an experience this summer. I recently graduated college, worked for a year in a mutual fund, and went to transition to tech, and quit my job in June and wound up taking a 12-week digital design boot camp, learning front end, UX, UI, that whole sort of startup gamut. And I feel as if I learned more in that 12 weeks than I did in 4 years of college.
No, it's interesting, again, in New York City, Institute. I mean, it started by a PACE dropout on a Harvard MBA, and it's disrupting education. They're now open in like 4 cities. Alan?
Yeah, I sort of pick up on what David said about government. Before I do, I'm going to put a little commercial in about what you said about people not learning stuff about startups. So we have a program called Startup Palooza. We've done it for years. We rank startups, and we have a workshop that helps them understand what makes them fundable. And I have a book coming out called Are You Fundable? And there are rules. I mean, you can tell. I also want to say that about David, a lot of people are not fundable by angel terms, but it doesn't mean to say they can't sell stuff. I mean, that's the real way to get funded, is to sell stuff. And a lot of these things neglect to remind you that if you sell something, you're being funded.
There are a couple of great books. Here's one I ask you. Great books on that.
Yeah.
No, and it's amazing with not being sexy. Everyone wants to study VC and market, but it's sales. You don't. How many of these conferences I went to? How many people are entrepreneurs? They all raise their hand. How many people are engaged in sales? No hands go up.
To finish out a little comment before I actually ask this question, a lot of incubators and entrepreneur spaces have all kinds of facilities and all kinds of cross pollination, but they don't have the sales force. People help you sell stuff, which to me. More important than all the advice in the world. But anyway, so here's the thing about government. I mean, we're talking about changing the environment, the marketing, the business world. But what about government? I mean, we still have a two-party system. We still have this. We aren't really in touch in a digital way with our elected.
But that's a two-edged sword, Alan, because the problem is if you actually apply all this technology to government, it would be extraordinarily efficient. You wouldn't need a Republican representative democracy. You'd be able to have real-time voting. And the question is, okay, should we go to war in Iraq? Everybody vote. Yeah, we got 30 minutes to go vote. Right, vote.
Well, you know what? I tell you, so real quick. So I had a little problem with the traffic department. I went up a one-way street. The sign was missing, and the cops are hanging out there writing tickets. And I thought, well, this is ridiculous. This is like racketeering. I mean, why don't you just call 311 and get the sign replaced? But no, they're writing tickets. So I got, the U.S. Highway had standards. I went to court. I still lost. I appealed. I still lost. I couldn't believe this. These people are looking out for themselves, protecting their own racket, right? And I found out something very interesting. I don't know how many people know this. If you have a dispute with the city or the state, you can actually take this to the state Supreme Court. There is an Article 78, which enables you to take on any administrative office in the state and fight them. However, you need a lawyer. You're advised to get a lawyer to do this. But the fact of the matter is, we actually have, now no one has digitally figured out how to help people do this. But I would say that here's a start, and I bet you there's a ton of laws there that with a digital input, you could really go in and shake people up, because they're not expecting you to come in there and take them on. And I just wanted to
they aren't. To answer that very quickly, I think one way that government is going to be held in check, because what makes our system great is a system of checks and balances, is states and municipalities are going to be competing, and where the central government or federal government is failing, states are going to step in, and you're going to have this competition among states. So respecting the time, we have 1 minute. Who didn't ask a question? Yes.
This is more of like an application. So like, what do the two of you recommend for like entrepreneurs that are looking to disrupt an industry that's really outdated? It's essentially monopolized. Like, what would you have really told Uber before they became Uber? If you could say like just a couple things that you would have possibly told them.
Uber, I would have said, be nice.
Well, now they're saying with love, Uber on all emails.
Well, no, but I think if you're an entrepreneur looking to disrupt an industry, you have to look, things are moving, so the core thing, there's, on the basis of the book of Singularities Near, there's something called Singularity University. out in California, Silicon Valley, which is sort of training the next generation of leaders to think in exponential terms. And coming through that program, you come out with what I consider to be like augmented reality goggles. You look at everything in terms of exponential growth. And as an entrepreneur, that means you can't look at where there's a hole in the market today. You got to try and figure out, based on all this stuff happening, where's the hole in the market tomorrow? And that's the thing you got to try and build now to meet that.
Yeah, tell the truth. Wouldn't you have told them not to do it? I mean, you're in New York, you'd say, you're not going to take on the taxi industry, you're not going to take on the hotel industry, don't do it.
I never say no to anybody. I say yes to altogether to all of it.
But I would say, though, because this is another thing you hear a lot, is people are like, I'm going to disrupt a $6 billion industry. You don't. You're not going to start. So like, that's the other thing you have to be really careful about is Uber didn't go, I'm going to disrupt a $20 billion industry. No, they know their customer segments. They're very smart. Like, so while, yes, eventually they do disrupt in industry, and you know, those guys have kind of an eye to, you know, the next corner that they want to go around. You kind of like, you also have to keep in mind of like, you don't disrupt industries by disrupting an industry. You don't become Google by becoming Google. You become Google by saying, you know what, I have something that's extremely powerful, but at the same time, so you actually, what you do is the disruption starts kind of like this. So you're like, I'm going to disrupt this small space first. And then once I disrupt that, I'm going to move
more crosses chasms.
Right. I'm going to disrupt more and more and more, and that's how you disrupt industries. So the one thing I would, if anybody who comes to me, or I advise or whatever, who says, I have an idea it's going to disrupt a $1.2 billion industry, I basically say, that's too big a problem you're trying to crack. And you don't really kind of understand the problem you're actually trying to solve. So that's the probably the biggest piece of advice I would get, because you drown in that. It's too big. But you should have a vision for the future. So those two things kind of are always in contention when you do this.
Represented perfectly is a closing line by Apple Computer's original motto. Anybody recall it? Apple Computer, changing the world, one person at a time.
Or as Wayne Gretzky said, you got to look where the puck is going, not where it is. When a lot of times the last thing is, you know, people discount the importance of luck, you know, and timing, but luck is where preparation meets opportunity. So keep working, look for opportunity, respecting the time. We're going to officially conclude. Thank you all for coming. Thank you for having us.